Okay, let's talk about A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. I hope you liked this short story. It's a particular favorite for me because there is so much going on in this really short story that literary critics have been debating various points about it since 1930, and the debates continue to go on. There are so many different approaches that we can take in discussing A Rose for Emily. But of course, for this class, we're going to focus on some of the aspects that tends to make A Rose for Emily actually a horror piece. In fact, a piece that demonstrates domestic horror. The sources for our presentation are Thomas Dilworth, Laura Getty, Lance Lyday, Nick Meltzerek, and James Wallace. Since I have all of these articles, I went ahead and posted them on Canvas. You don't have to read them. I'm not assigning them. But if you want to look at them for more detail, possibly to use for your paper, then I provided the article so that you can do that if you would like to. Let's start out, of course, by looking at the surface horror in Rose for Emily. Now, reportedly, Faulkner at one point said that Rose for Emily is a ghost story. People asked Faulkner from the time he wrote this story what this story actually is and actually what it's supposed to be doing. And he would say things like, well, it's very evasive. And at one point he said it was a ghost story, but he resisted actually discussing everything that's going on in this story. But we do see in the last 5 paragraphs that there is an obvious surface horror to this story. And we're also going to see that the true horror is actually occurring throughout the entire short story. But the surface horror, of course, is the implied murder and necrophilia that we find out about at the end of the story. Now, it's very clear in the last 5 paragraphs that Homer has died in Emily's house. And even just piecing together surface information, we know that Emily has murdered him. We learn that Emily has bought arsenic, and then we learn that Emily's cousins have left before Homer returns. And by simply adding those 2 facts with the fact that the last time that anyone sees Homer is when he enters Emily's house, pretty much tells us whose skeleton we're looking at and how he's died. Now, even more chilling than the murder, of course, is that the community sees an indentation of a head on the pillow next to the skeleton, and the skeleton is lying in the position of an embrace. Then when we add to that, we see that the town finds an iron gray hair on the pillow next to the skeleton. And we know from very early in the short story that Emily has iron gray hair. That pretty much tells us that at least during part of the years after Homer dies, Emily has, to some degree, a sexual relationship with Homer. Now, necrophilia was, and still is, one of the sexual behaviors the society views with really great shock and abhorrence. Respect for the dead has been a part of Western culture since ancient Greece, and necrophilia is a serious breach of that social expectation, as well as being a sexual activity that is, well, in most people's opinion, gross. But as horrible as Emily's actions are, as we're going to see, the true horror lies more in what is done to her, not by her. In fact, as we shall see, the community is just as guilty of Homer's murder as Emily is. Now, the setting of this story is particularly important. It's set in a fictitious town called Jefferson, which is the seat of the fictitious Yoknapatawpha County in Mississippi. And that county is a county that Faulkner invents, that he uses in many, many of his works. And not only do so many of his works take place in this county, but the same characters tend to show up in different works that he has written. For example, Colonel Sartoris is a character in some of his works, and for that matter, so are some of the Griersons. So Faulkner invents a county and a community in the Deep South in the years right after the Civil War. In this case, it's believed that this story takes place from sometime right around 1893, which is during the Civil War, and we know that Emily's father fought in the Civil War, and it ends sometime around 1935. We're going to take a look at the chronology, and as we're going to discuss, one of the things that literary critics who have nothing better to talk about has debated for all these years are the exact years that each action in the story takes place, and nobody's ever been able to come up with the exact years. But we can at least determine that the time period is from sometime right around 1893 to sometime right around 1935. We know that Emily is born during the Civil War, and that the incidents take place right after it. Now, Faulkner is not usually considered a horror author, and most of his works are not horrific in terms of how most of us define horror. Actually, his work, Faulkner is one of several Southern authors who wrote in the early 20th century and struggled with the problems of being proud to be a Southerner and feeling both love and loyalty to the South, and at the same time feeling deeply guilty and very embarrassed and sorry about the South's connection to slavery because of the Civil War and the antebellum South. Antebellum means before the Civil War. Okay. Now, we see that tension in a lot of Faulkner's works, and we definitely see it in Rose for Emily. For example, we learn very early in the story that Emily's house is architecturally in the style of the Old South, but it's surrounded by modern industrial businesses. Symbolically, her house, and in fact, the entire story, can be seen as the South's attempting to cling to a dead culture, even though the modern one is in place, just as Emily holds on to a dead person. Now, it's also important to note that community in A Rose for Emily plays the role that it plays in many of Faulkner's works. According to Lancelot Day, the community is an unseen force in a lot of Faulkner's short stories and novels, and that this force works to exert constant pressure on characters. In some of these works, that pressure is not very obvious, but in A Rose for Emily, of course, it is. Now, Lydé says that Faulkner's characters often define themselves in relationship to the community. So, Emily is strongly motivated to conform with the community's expectations of her, much more so than we might be in modern times in areas that are not in the South, and particularly in large cities. So As Dilworth points out, Emily does rebel against the community expectations just by dating Homer at all. But the community pressures her through high expectations, direct interference, and just constant gossip, so that she eventually does, at least on the surface and as far as the community knows, conform with their expectations of her. Of course, she doesn't really. What she really does is devise a plan that will allow her, in her view, to keep Homer as a lover. Okay. To understand exactly what the community does, we have to view the events in the story in the way that the community experiences them, chronologically. Now, A Rose for Emily has a nonlinear chronology, and while that strikes us as strange in some cases, such as movies, for example, it doesn't seem very strange or intentional or devious as we read the short story. After all, when we reminisce about friends, or when we talk about friends we know, we tend to relate incidents in the order they occur to us, and that's not necessarily chronological order. So the nonlinear chronology seems quite appropriate for the reminiscence of a woman who has died. And its sinister nature appears only when we entangle the chronology and see the events as the community experienced them. Now, according to Nick Zarek, at least 11 critics have attempted to assign specific years to the incidents, and nobody's been able to do that. But everyone pretty much agrees on the order in which the events occur, and that's what really matters more than the exact date that every single solitary incident takes place. The table that you have here lists the order that events actually occur in. Now, I provided this table for you in Microsoft Word and recommended that you print it out so that you can look at it as we go through the presentation. But for right now, at least, take a look at the page number column on the right. And look at how it jumps around. Now, we listed the events in the order that they really took place chronologically, but we can see that the page numbers jump all over the place. We go from the first thing that happens is her father dies, and we learn about that on page 185, and then after that, Colonel Sartoris remits her taxes, because we know that he does that after her father dies. But that's discussed on page 182. And the entire story goes on that way. And even though there are so many events that are discussed on page 188, they aren't necessarily discussed in the order that they actually took place. Also, take a look and notice that we learn about the smell, which is, as we see, is going to become very important, relatively early in the story, certainly before Homer is even introduced to the story. Not only that, but the story relates it as happening 2 years after her father's death and a short time after her sweetheart had deserted her. So the emphasis, or at least the tie between the smell and a death, when the smell is discussed, actually kind of ties the smell to Emily's father's death. But since the smell comes up 2 years after her father dies, we're told that the community is able to get her father's body and bury it, we don't associate that smell with any dead human body. And we're going to talk about why that's important in a little bit. But what I want you to do right now is ask yourself this. When you read this story, did you in any way associate that smell with Homer's death? Probably not. Most people don't. And if you didn't, you see how presenting the incidents in a nonlinear fashion hides the source of the smell. And as we'll see, that is a significant point. Okay, let's look at the expectations that the community holds for Emily, since we've talked about the fact that meeting community expectations would be very important to her. Now, as Dilworth points out, all women in the United States, and pretty much in Western culture altogether, were expected in the late 19th century and early 20th century to be virgins until their marriage. And that pressure was even greater, Dilworth tells us, in the South. In the South, during the years that A Rose for Emily takes place, the South viewed itself as a defeated culture. Now, we all tend to idolize the past. And particularly we do this as we get older. Take my word for it. But a defeated culture is particularly prone to look back to the good old days and idealize them even more. As Dilworth indicates, the post-war Southerners, and that of course is post-Civil War, tended to view the antebellum South as a kind of paradise. And women were expected to maintain the purity of Eve in the Garden of Eden, although, of course, they were to be fully clothed. Now, as Dilworth indicates, these expectations are even higher for Emily because she is the living symbol of the antebellum South, according to the people of Jefferson. The Griersons had been wealthy plantation owners before the war, and they remain wealthy, or at least they were able to retain the image of wealth up until the time that Emily's father dies. Now, as a result of this, we know that Emily's father rejects all the young men in Jefferson as not being good enough for Emily. So not only are the Griersons financially well off, but they're very snotty about it. They're very aware of the fact, or at least Emily's father is very aware of the fact, that the Griersons are wealthy and are of a higher social class than most of the people in Jefferson. And that's why he doesn't allow Emily to date anybody in town, or at least that's the surface reason. And as a result, Emily never even gets to date anybody. And then we're told that after Emily's father dies, the town takes on his role. And so what we end up with is an Emily who is a spinster in her 30s. And we have to remember that at this point, most women in the South and elsewhere, but particularly in the South, usually got married before they were 20 years old. But then Homer comes along, and of course he's not one of the townsmen that had already been rejected as being unworthy. So for the very first time, Emily finds somebody that she can have a normal, mature relationship with. But as we shall see, the town will not allow her to forget noblesse oblige, which is the assumed obligation that the privileged carry to act in a noble fashion. Now, as Dilworth states, while Emily's social status allows her certain privileges, and it does, there are also expectations that are placed on her. And these expectations, according to Dilworth, carry a tremendous price. Being considered special isolates an individual from others in any case. And sometimes people want that. I really can't see somebody in Bill Gates's family wanting to hang out with people like you and me. They are in a different class, and that's just perfectly fine with them. So that isolation is okay in some cases. But it's not when you live in a community where you're the only person that is considered special in whatever way you're considered special. And for Emily, this isolation um, denied her physical affection and the ability to fulfill her sexual and emotional needs by sharing her life with a partner. And Dilworth says that the long denial of these needs leads Emily to a relationship with a man who is not only a laborer, but a Yankee. Now, at this period, the idea of a Southerner even being close friends with a Yankee is almost unheard of in the South, and certainly dating one. Well, that's just not something that a good Southern woman would have done shortly after the Civil War. And so the people of Jefferson consider Emily's dating a Yankee and a laborer beneath her and completely inappropriate. And after a year, of course, the town starts assuming that there's also a premarital sexual component in this relationship, which of course makes the relationship completely unacceptable in their eyes. Now, the town's high expectations lead the town to interfere directly in Emily's life on 2 occasions. And while holding the high expectations is one thing, actually interfering in somebody's life is really going a lot further. When Emily begins dating Homer, the town is kind of divided in its opinion on how serious her breach of their expectations is. On the one hand, they're happy that Emily has a beau. But on the other, they do think that he's not good enough for her, as we've talked about. But then, of course, the longer she dates him, the more serious the relationship appears, and the more intensely the town disapproves. And once they think that there is a sexual component, well, their disapproval becomes particularly potent after that. Still, Emily is able to resist conforming until the town directly interferes with her ability to live her life as she chooses and continue her relationship with Homer. The first way that they interfere directly, of course, is by sending in the Baptist minister. And Emily is Episcopalian. Now, Southern Baptists were, and to some degree still are, a very fundamentalist Christian denomination. For example, and pardon this, I don't mean it to be offensive, but it is kind of funny. There's a joke, why don't Southern Baptists have sex standing up? And the answer is because they think it will lead to dancing. Extremely fundamentalist religions don't even allow their members to dance. They think it's a sin because the touching and so forth is somewhat sexual in nature. And that's true whether we're talking about waltzes or square dances or modern dances. Now, we aren't told what happens when the Baptist member goes to see Emily. He refuses to talk about it, which, considering how much gossip is going on, as we're going to talk about, is pretty unusual in and of itself. But we can probably assume that she put him in his place in no uncertain terms. We can kind of base that assumption on the 3 cases in which we see Emily interact with town members. When the aldermen visit her about her taxes early in the story, which is actually one of the last events of the story, and when the women visit her after her father's death, and when she interacts with the pharmacist, we see that Emily assumes complete control of the interaction and the dialogue, and she insists on having her way regardless of what the townspeople say to her. She asserts her status as a member of the privileged class and then limits her interactions to the bare minimum. And once she gets what she needs, she either sends people on their way very quickly, or in the case of going to the pharmacy, she just abruptly leaves once her needs are fulfilled. Then, of course, when sending in the minister doesn't get Emily to stop seeing Homer, they call in her cousins to stay with her as a chaperone. Now, that's very problematic for Emily. First of all, she doesn't hold any special status in their eyes because they're as wealthy and in the same socioeconomic class that Emily would be in. They are as privileged as she is, and we know that they're probably even more snotty about their social status than Emily is because the town says that they're more Grierson than she is. So, being a member of a privileged class doesn't do her any good. And unlike with members of the community, she can't kick them out of the house or leave them because they're staying with her. In her view, there's no escape. And for a proud woman in her 30s to have to deal with having live-in chaperones, well, that's just the last straw. I mean, can you imagine as an adult who's been living on your own for, by that point, it probably would have been at least 3-4 years since her father has died. And somebody calls in relatives to basically babysit you? I mean, nobody is going to accept that kind of treatment. And Emily certainly doesn't. And she can't escape. So, because of the timing on the chronology table, if we look at that, it seems like their constant presence is what eventually motivates Emily to hatch a plan to create the appearance that she and Homer would marry. So she goes out and she buys men's clothing and man's nightshirt and men's toiletry items. And the town does say, well, maybe they're going to get married. They must be going to get married since she bought these things for him. And who knows? Maybe initially she's even hoping that she'll be able to convince Homer to marry him, despite the fact that he says that he isn't the marrying kind. But we do know that whether Emily plans to ask Homer to marry him or not, she does arrange a contingency plan because she purchases arsenic. So we know that she makes these arrangements and then she gets the cousins to leave. Now, we also know, and there are many, many articles about this, and it's really an interesting topic, but it's not one that we really are going to take the time to focus on. But Emily, time doesn't mean anything to Emily. And she doesn't really recognize that there is a difference between a dead person and a live person. We know that because after her father dies, she insists that he's not dead. Eventually, the town manages to get the body from her so that they can bury her father. But she never actually admits that he's dead because the difference between life and death seems to be very blurred in Emily's view. And so that means that the difference between marrying Homer as a live person and killing him as a way to keeping him with her is fairly insignificant in her view. Either way, she'd have Homer to herself for the rest of her life, and the town either would shut up because she marries him or wouldn't know that he is still there. Now, as bad as the direct interference is, and it's really only the last straw that broke the camel's back. Okay? Um, in fact, gossiping about Emily and the Griersons seems to be the town's favorite sport throughout her entire life. Of course, that gossip intensifies when she begins to date Homer. And of all the gossip, after all, in fact, in all situations, when it comes to gossip, there's little gossip that's more interesting than juicy tales of forbidden romance and sex. So Emily's dating a Yankee laborer and eventually, in the town's view, having sex with him is like a World Series of gossip for Jefferson. Now, Faulkner makes it very clear that the town gossips about her. He frequently uses phrases like "we said" and "it got about," meaning that people are talking about her. But Wallace says that it's clear that gossip is even more widespread than Faulkner says, especially if we assume that the narrator is one person, and that's something that is actually debated by critics. After all, the character uses a plural pronoun. It's always we, never I. So some critics argue that the entire town is the narrator and not one person. But after arguing that the narrator is a single human being and providing some evidence for that, Wallace points out that there is no way that one person could know everything that narrator knows in the detail the narrator knows it unless the gossip is even more widespread and detailed than Faulkner's direct statements indicate. For example, the narrator knows in sufficient detail what happens when the women visit Emily after her father's death to be able to use direct quotes in relating the incident. But then the narrator also relates in really specific detail what the men do when they spread the lime on Emily's property. Now, the narrator can't be both a woman who visits Emily after her father dies and a man who spreads lime, because people can't be both men and women. In addition to that, the narrator can't be part of both the older generation that deals with the smell incident and the younger generation of aldermen that talks to Emily about her taxes. Now, Wallace explains this and then concludes that since the narrator can't be both male and female, or the member of two separate generations, the detail with which the narrator describes these events could be supplied only by extensive, widespread, never-ending spying and gossiping. And the widespread, ongoing, detailed gossip is probably the strongest motivating factor in the murder, I think. The direct interference is more difficult to deal with, of course, and more difficult to accept. And perhaps if the town had limited their actions to just gossip, Emily could have ignored it altogether. But if Emily had thought that getting rid of the cousins would solve her problems, well, then she wouldn't have any reason to kill Homer, since once she gets rid of the cousins, the problem is solved, and they leave before Homer comes back. So it's the gossip that is an ongoing problem. It's simply never ending. So Emily knows that while the direct interference may be the most obvious problem, and may well be the big straws that broke the camel's back. It's not really an indication that her problems aren't solved. She gets rid of those things, but the gossip's going to be ongoing. And since Emily knows that this is true, she knows that the people of Jefferson are never going to let her be with Homer. So it's this constant ongoing gossip that is, I think, the strongest motivating factor that leads Emily to kill Homer. Now, we've seen that through high expectations, direct interference, and gossip, the town motivates Emily to kill Homer. But that's not all they do. The town knows that she has committed murder very shortly after she does it and covers it up. And we're going to talk about that now. Now, there are a couple of pieces of evidence that make the town's knowledge fairly obvious. And one thing is that when we untwist the chronology and view the events in the order that the town experiences them, we see that the town has to know that Emily has killed Homer. Looking at our chronology chart, which, as I said, I hope you printed out, you can see that Emily buys the poison and then gets rid of the cousins, and then is the last person in Jefferson to see Homer. And as Wallace points out, when we chronologically review the events, which is the way that the town would have seen them, we can see that the town had to be at least suspicious that Emily has killed Homer. I mean, they certainly have more evidence of her killing him than they have to support the idea that she has a sexual relationship with him, but they make that assumption as an absolute surety. So the town certainly had to suspect that Emily has committed murder. But Dilworth gives us even stronger evidence that they had to know, and that they had to know within a couple of weeks. If we look at historical information, we learn a lot about why those people would have known what was causing that smell. In the story, we learn that the smell is widespread and strong enough to create protests for more than just the immediate neighbors who live right next door to Emily. Judge Stevens writes the town's complaint off to the smell being created by a dead snake or a rat on the property. But as Dilworth points out, a small dead animal would not create such a strong odor. And then in addition, as Dilworth maintains, it's clear that the smell isn't created by the corpse of a large dead animal either. For one thing, the corpse of a large dead animal would be immediately visible to the men who go to spread the line. But even more telling, Dilworth says, is the fact that the men spread line in the outhouses and the cellar. And as Dilworth says, people aren't likely to drag a dead animal into those places, but they sure make good places to hide a dead human body. And there's even more evidence connected to the smell. And this is, I think, just really cool, and I hadn't thought of it until I read this article. As Dilworth explains, the townspeople would have known what a dead human body smelled like. Bodies weren't embalmed at that point in history, and funerals were held in relatives' houses, which means that most people would have had a dead body in their house at one point or the other, and the dead body begins to smell. Even today, most of the time, funerals are 3 days after a death, and of course, we all send flowers. There were practical reasons for that. When you've got a smelly dead body in your house, you want to bury it after about 3 days because the smell becomes really noticeable. And of course, sending flowers helps cover that smell. That's where those traditions started to begin with. So it's very obvious that these people knew what a dead human body smelled like. They knew it wasn't a small animal because the smell is too strong. They knew it wasn't a dead large animal because when the men went to spread line, they didn't see one. And they knew what a dead human being smelled like anyway. So when they go to spread that line, and that smell is created about 2 weeks after Homer leaves, they know. They have to know that Emily has killed Homer. And that's what the smell is coming from. But the town makes absolutely no attempt to investigate the murder. And that's why the body isn't discovered for about 40 years. Now, Dilworth says that one reason they don't investigate may be because they know on some level that they have motivated the murder. And also, as Dilworth states, prosecuting Emily would force them to look at their values. Because remember, the town sees her as the living symbol of an idyllic South that they hold very dear. It's just easier for the town to ignore the murder than it is to undertake that painful self-exploration and what it says about the value of holding on to a dead culture. Because that's very similar to Emily holding on to dead bodies. It's easier to just ignore that. The problem is, as Dilworth points out, covering up the murder indicates that the town is actually complicit in her committing it. And legally, it even makes the entire town accessories after the fact to murder. So the town successfully covers the murder up for about 40 years. But after Emily's death, the narrator feels compelled to tell the full story and to confess. But the narrator knows that a direct, outright confession would bring the town's wrath down on the narrator. So the fact that the story is a confession is only alluded to, and it is presented as just reminiscences about a dead member of the community. But the narrator does provide clues to the confessional nature of the story. As Laura Getty points out, the title provides some evidence. In the Christian religion, confession is most closely connected with the Catholic tradition, sorry about that, of confessing to a priest. And this takes place in confessionals. Now, traditional confessionals always had an ornate rose carved at the entrance. And we can even see that in this picture to some degree. Right there is the carving of a rose. And as we know, the sins confessed in a confessional are held in really strict confidence. So much so that even today, priests can't be required to reveal what has been said in a confessional in a court of law. They can't be called on to testify in legal cases based on something that was confessed in a confessional. In fact, as Getty states, the rose became so closely tied with secrecy and confidentiality because it was carved on the confessional that it gave rise to the phrase sub rosa, which means in secret. At no point in the story are roses specifically mentioned, as you notice. And that's led to a lot of debate among critics, because the title is A Rose for Emily, and there are no roses in this story. Now, Getty maintains that the word rose in the title refers to the fact that the story is a secret confession because of the rose's association with the confidential confessional that is Catholic tradition. Now, furthermore, Melchizedek maintains that the need to confess this in secret is the reason that the narrator employs a nonlinear chronology to begin with. As we've already talked about, the nonlinear chronology doesn't strike us as suspicious when we initially read the story, because we all tend to relate remembrances of a friend in the order that they occur to us, and that's not always chronological. But when we untangle the chronology and then examine the town's role in motivating the murder, and consider the town's knowledge of what a dead body smells like, then we can see that the story is actually a confession, and that the narrator has intentionally chosen a nonlinear chronology to disguise it as simply a reminiscence. We've seen this before, or at least in theory. Kubrick's movie, The Shining, is theoretically, or at least according to one theory, it's actually his confessing to producing what was televised as the shots of the moon landings, remember? But he couldn't come right out and say it because he was afraid of what happened. So he took his confession and he converted it into a movie that was kind of based on the novel but had a lot of changes. But we're used to that, aren't we? We go to see a movie that's based on a book. The movie and the book sometimes aren't much alike. So that didn't strike us as strange. It was only when a critic came forth with this theory and offered evidence that he possibly had shot the moon landings that we put the two together and see the movie as possibly a confession. Same thing's going on in this story. Who knows? Kubrick undoubtedly read this story. Maybe he even came up with the idea. I'm not saying that he did and nobody else has said he did, but it's possible. Okay? So we've seen this kind of thing happen in real life, or at least theoretically we've seen it. And so we see that in a way, A Rose for Emily is a confession that the town motivates the murder, approves of the murder to some degree, and covers the murder up for 40 years. And that means that looking at this story on the whole, we do see that the obvious horror lies in murder and necrophilia. But the deeper horror springs from, as an old song says, it isn't very pretty what a town without pity can do. And that is domestic horror. Well, I hope that gives you some more information about A Rose for Emily that helps you see how it works as a domestic horror story and also helps you enjoy this short story a little bit more. It really is amazing how much Faulkner packed into such a really, really short story. It's only a few pages long, but there's so much going on in it. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. And you know, of course, that if you have any questions, all you have to do is email me through Canvas. Have a great day. We'll get together again soon.